Hey guys, welcome back to another video. We have been sent home from the office, so we are now working from home once again. In today's video, we're going to toss it over to Zach Allen, who you guys have seen before. He's the one that created that really cool hammer throw effect a while back. He's going to be covering a very highly requested effect for you guys today, so pay attention, have fun, and we'll see you all at the end of the video.
Hello everyone, I'm Zach Allen from the YouTube channel Zach Allen Productions. Today I will be showing you how to create a Marvel-style intro sequence using HitFilm Pro and Blender. This title sequence can be created in HitFilm Express, but requires the 3D Model Render add-on, the 3D Particles add-on, and the VFX Lighting add-on. Other add-ons are also required to recreate my steps exactly, but aren't necessary to achieve similar results. Because this title sequence is very complex, I won't be showing you every single step, making this project not suitable for beginners. Down in the video description, you will find many links to various HitFilm and Blender tutorials to help you get more familiar with the techniques I will be using. My project settings are 1080p at 24 frames per second, so if you are using a different resolution or frame rate, the position and timing values will have to be adjusted to achieve the same look. The first part of the title sequence is an intro with the appearance of flipping comic pages. To create the comic pages, I exported single-frame image files from various FXhome projects. Most of these videos had a letterbox applied, so I changed the resolution of the comp to crop out the black bars. Once you have all of your comic images saved, drag them into a new composite shot in the order you want them to appear. I'd recommend starting with just a few images, as the work done on them can be copied and pasted onto all the other images later. Choose an image with a good amount of detail and add the cartoon effect. Adjust the settings to your liking to create a comic page look. Copy and paste the effect onto the other images on the timeline. In my project, each image takes 4 frames to appear, so the first image only needs to last 4 frames. On the second image, animate the opacity to fade in from 0 to 100% over those 4 frames. Next, add an angle blur effect and animate it to start strong and go down to 0. This will give the illusion that the comic page is moving instead of simply fading in. Every layer after the first one can then be trimmed to be 8 frames long, so the underlying image is still visible while the new image is fading in. You can then copy and paste the attributes to apply the animation to the next image, and drag it on the timeline until it snaps to the edge of the previous layer. Also make sure that the images are filling the frame if they have been cropped. Once you have your animation in place, drag in every other comic image and stack them in the order you want them to appear in. Trim all the layers to last only 8 frames, then copy the layer with the finished animation and scale adjustments, select all the other image layers, and paste the attributes. Shift the layers on the timeline so they start at the right time. Once all of the layers are in place, one finishing touch to add some more detail is to create a new grade layer and add the halftone color effect. This effect gives the image the appearance of being a printed comic page. Increase the resolution all the way to get a more subtle result. I'd also recommend decreasing the opacity of the grade layer to make the effect even less prominent, as it can be quite distracting. The next part of the title sequence is a 3D scene containing images of the FXhome team. I have already gone ahead and removed the background from the photos. This can be done in any photo editor, or even with HitFilm's masking and keying tools. Make one of the images into a composite shot and create a new white plane. Add a radial reveal effect. Reduce the gradient size and decrease the reveal length to create a sharp and quick transition. This plane layer will be used as a matte for the photo. To create a more interesting drawing animation, add the heat distortion effect to the plane. I chose to disable both of the diffusion settings and set the speed settings to 0. Adjust the scale and distortion amount to create a detailed distorted edge. You can add multiple heat distortion effects with different settings to add even more detail. Now add a set matte effect to the image layer. We can't source the plane layer directly because the effects won't be read by the set matte, so we'll have to add a grade layer and source that instead. Set the source to luminance, the blend to subtract, and invert the matte. Hide both the grade layer and the plane, and your image should now be drawn over time. Another detail we can add to this transition is an outline of the character which is drawn first. Duplicate the image layer and remove the set matte effect. Add a fill color effect and set the color to black. Then add an inner glow effect and adjust the settings to get a thin white outline. Next, apply the pinwheel animation effect. This creates the effect of the outline being drawn in 4 separate lines. Finally, ensure that the plane layer is above the outline layer and shift it on the timeline by a few frames so it starts later. Now the image appears to be traced and then filled in. Apply this matte transition to all of the other images. To add some variation, try changing the noise seed on the heat distortion as well as the center position on the radial reveal and pinwheel animation effects. Once you are done prepping your images, bring them into a new comp that's about 14 seconds long. Make the layers 3D, and around 4 seconds in, add a keyframe to the camera's position. At the end of the shot, move the camera far back in Z-space. Now that the camera is moving, choose your starting image and shift it on the timeline to start after 4 seconds. Adjust the position in 3D space. On the next image, shift it even further on the timeline and move it closer to the camera. It will take some trial and error to get the timing and positioning correct. I would suggest getting all the images roughly timed and in position first, then going back and refining the images and the camera animation speed afterwards. The images should be spread throughout the duration of the shot, so the last image fades in close to the very end. Once all the images are in place, you can begin adding the text which accompanies each character. Create a new composite shot for each text layer so that it will be easier to isolate and edit the text. I used the font called Courier New and added a slight white outline to add a little more thickness to the letters. Adjust the font size as needed, keeping in mind that every text layer you create should have the same font size to keep the scale consistent. I chose not to fill the entire frame with a larger font size since I knew some of the other text would contain more letters. Drag your text comp onto the timeline and make it 3D. Parent it to the corresponding image layer and reset the position. Move the text closer to the camera to add more depth to the scene and adjust the position to your liking. In the media panel, duplicate the text comp, rename it, and edit the text layer within. Repeat the process of adding it to the scene and positioning it. I also chose to reduce the scale and give the text layers a slight rotation. Now that the main elements of the scene are in place, it is time to add some more detail and atmosphere to the shot. I'll start by creating a fog effect using the particle simulator. Set the emitter shape to cube and increase the dimensions so the box encompasses our entire 3D scene. Choose one of the built-in textures and increase the scale so the particles fill more of the frame. Also make sure that the particle lifetime extends for the entire duration of the shot. Add some variation to the scale, as well as the texture angle and texture angle per second controls. Reduce the alpha to make the particles more transparent. At the beginning of the shot, keyframe the particles per second to start around 1000 and drop down to 0 over a single frame. Set the time shift to -1 second so the particles are created before the shot begins. Once you have the basic fog effect created, feel free to play around with the different settings such as speed, texture, scale, and particles per second. I also chose to add a diffuse effect to soften the particles. Next, I added a 3D light to the scene to help the fog particles match the lighting on the photos. I chose to disable illumination in the material controls for the images and text layers so the lights wouldn't affect them. But you could also separate the lights from the 3D images using a 2D layer. I moved the first light to the left side of the screen, set the falloff to linear, and adjusted the reach so it wouldn't affect the right side. I also moved the light in front of all the particles in Z-space and parented it to the camera so it would illuminate the particles more evenly and consistently, even when the camera moved. I then changed the color to magenta to match the magenta side light on the photos. Next, I duplicated this light, moved it to the right, and changed the color to be yellow. Finally, adjust the opacity of the particle simulator layer to make the fog effect more subtle, and fade it in so it isn't visible for the first few seconds where the comic pages will go. Drag in the comic pages comp from earlier and fade them in at the beginning of the shot. Set the layer to 3D and parent it to the camera. This way, the comic pages don't appear to fly away when the camera starts moving, but the layer is still 3D, so we can rotate it and move it in 3D space as needed. Animate the opacity to fade out once some of the other text and images start coming into view. Animate the position and Y rotation to push and rotate the comic pages back as they fade out. You will notice hard edges where this layer ends, so double-click on the rounded rectangle mask tool. Set the feather direction to in, and increase it to get rid of the hard edges. Before the comic pages start to move, the feather isn't needed, so I animated the mask expansion to increase and hide the feather. I also adjusted the Z position of the layer to bring it closer to the camera and hide more of that soft edge. Now the sequence starts off with the flipping comic pages and smoothly transitions into the next section. To add more visual interest to the 3D scene, I added some light flares using the Radiance 3.0 preset pack. I imported the composite shots of 3 different flares that I liked and adjusted the settings. My main goal with the flares was to add some anamorphic streaks. I wasn't interested in the bright hotspots at the center of the flares, so I disabled those effects. I then copied and pasted the flare layers into the main comp and set the flare control points to 3D, positioning them throughout the 3D scene. Finally, I added various lighting effects on a grade layer to tie everything together. The effects I used were gleam, glow, anamorphic lens flare, lens dirt, chromatic aberration, curves, a vignette, and film grain. I also added zoom blur effects on the images with the center point on the team member's face, as well as on the text layers. Next up is a transition between this section and the 3D logo section. The Marvel intro uses a slow motion clip of Captain America, but I chose to use Javert's energy ball clip. The transition clip only needs to be about 3 seconds long. Drag your footage into a new comp, and just like we did with the comic pages, export a few frames from the beginning of the clip. Bring these images back into HitFilm and trim them to be 8 frames long. This time I chose to actually animate the images falling into frame, but you could also use the fade in and angle blur method from before. Trim the rest of your footage so it starts on the frame your animation left off at. Create a new point layer and parent all of the other layers to it. Animate the scale of the point so the footage appears to zoom out, matching the general camera motion of the previous section. Create a new 40-second composite shot. This is where the different sections of the title sequence will be edited together. Drag in the intro section to start 1 second in. Then drag in the transition comp so the page flip animation finishes when the intro section comp finishes. Animate the opacity of the transition comp to fade in while it overlaps the intro section. To finish off the transition, add a new grade layer. We'll be using various lighting effects to brighten the comp while the transition is taking place. The effects I used were exposure, gleam, and light leak, and I animated the values to increase the brightness up to the transition point, then fade back out once the energy ball clip had taken over. Now it's time to create the 3D logo in Blender. I'm using version 2.83. We're actually going to use the default cube in this project, but I'll hide it for now. Create a new text object, and in edit mode, type out your text. Change the font in the text controls panel. Links to the fonts I'm using will be in the video description. Adjust the geometry offset and the character spacing. Center both of the alignment options and adjust the position offset to center the text. Add some extrusion to the text and then convert the text object into a mesh. Unhide the cube and in wireframe mode, go to the top view and scale the cube to create a box surrounding the letters. Also scale it on the Z-axis to your desired thickness, which should be thinner than the extruded text. Hide the text object and add a Boolean modifier to the cube. Select the text as the object source. You now have the text cut out of your cube. Set the cube object to smooth shading and enable auto smooth in the cube's normals settings. This will keep the sharp corners looking sharp while smoothing out the curved surfaces. Once you are happy with how the text is looking, apply the Boolean modifier. Since we scaled the cube unevenly to create our rectangular box, apply the scale in the object controls. This will help bevel operations to work properly and be even as opposed to stretching out like our box. Go into edit mode and select the top faces of the logo object. The geometry will not be ideal, as the Boolean modifier creates faces with more than 4 sides, which are referred to as n-gons. Having n-gons in your model can cause various issues, but in this case, they shouldn't be a problem. With the top faces selected, inset them to create a border around each letter. Select the edges surrounding each letter by holding the Alt key and selecting one of the edges in the loop. If Blender doesn't select the full loop, try dissolving any extra edges on the inset border, as they are creating n-gons on the interior walls of the letters, preventing Blender from being able to select the full loop. Once you have the letter edges selected, add a small bevel and increase the segments to add more detail to the model. Create 2 materials. One will be chrome for the beveled edges, and the other will be brushed metal for the front face of the logo. Give them different colors to identify them. With the beveled edges still selected, apply the chrome material. Invert your selection, then apply the other material. Select the interior faces of each letter, and separate them from the main object. Create new materials of different colors, and assign them to the separated letter objects. Create a new text object and repeat the earlier steps to choose a font, align the text, and add an extrusion. Also add a bevel and the text geometry controls. Convert the text to a mesh object and assign the chrome and brushed metal materials. Create a new cube object and scale and move it into place, ensuring that it is slightly larger than the text. Apply the scale, bevel the edges, and assign the materials. Create a new material and assign it to only the bottom face of the new box. This will be used to add a red glow later on. Duplicate the object, move it down, and rotate it 180 degrees to create symmetrical bars above and below the text. Also make sure to set the new objects to smooth shading and enable auto smooth. Select your letter objects and go into edit mode. In the top view, activate wireframe mode and select and dissolve any vertices that aren't on a corner. This will make sure that the interior walls of the letters all contain faces with only 4 sides. Also delete the original text object so it isn't exported with the rest of the model. Select the side faces of all the objects and apply a new material to them. This will be a darker metal material to make the front face and bevel stand out more. Change the base color of the brushed metal material to use an image texture, and browse to the brushed metal texture file linked in the description. In edit mode of the main logo object, select the top faces, and in the select menu, choose Select Similar, then Normal. UV unwrap them using the Project from View method. Rotate the faces in the UV editor to change the orientation of the texture on the model. Scale them to fill the frame. Repeat this process for the other objects that require the brushed metal texture. In the Viewport Overlays dropdown, enable Face Orientation. One of my objects displays as red, meaning that the faces are pointing in the wrong direction. This would cause them not to render properly in HitFilm. In edit mode, select all of the incorrect faces and flip the normals. Now it's time to UV unwrap the letters. These objects will require a little more effort to unwrap. Simply hitting U and selecting Unwrap produces a distorted circular shape, meaning we will have to add seams. Strategically select various vertical edges on the letter model and mark them as seams. After unwrapping again, there are multiple separate rectangular sections, each of which represents where a video file will be placed in HitFilm. To make things easier later on in HitFilm, I'll add in a UV checker image. This image contains a grid with numbers, which will help us visualize how the texture is being applied to the model. In some areas of the model, the numbers on the texture appear upside down or backwards. Select that section of faces and rotate them in 90-degree increments in the UV editor to make sure the numbers appear in the correct orientation. Also scale and move the faces in the UV editor to make use of the space efficiently. While it may be more space efficient to have certain sections rotated vertically, it will make our lives easier once we get into HitFilm if we align them consistently. Repeat this UV unwrapping process for all of the other letters. Once you are done, remove the texture from the letter materials and give them each a unique color again. This will help HitFilm keep the materials separate instead of merging them into one. Go into the camera view and lock the camera to the view. You can now position your viewport and the 3D camera will follow. When you have the camera position pretty close, you can type in exact values in the camera's transform controls. Set the end frame of the timeline to 480 to make it last for 20 seconds. I chose to give my camera a wider angle lens of 35mm instead of the default 50 to make it easier to position the camera up close to the logo model. Create a new NURBS curve object. This will represent the camera's motion path. In edit mode, adjust the points to position the curve where you want it. You can then subdivide the curve to add more points, giving you more control over the shape of the curve. Make the curve start inside one of the letters and end up at the camera's current position. This will take a lot of fine-tuning and adjustment and is entirely dependent on your 3D scene, as your camera will likely be starting in a different letter than mine. Once you have the curve roughly in place, add a follow path constraint to the camera and sort the curve object we created. Set the up parameter to Y and the forward parameter to -Z to orient the camera correctly. Also set the camera's position to 0, 0, 0 so it sits on the curve properly. Check Fix Position. Now the offset slider can be used and animated to control the camera's position along the curve. Create an empty and position it above the logo. This object will be used to control where the camera is looking. Add a Track To constraint to the camera and source the empty. Set Up to Y and To to -Z. Now the camera will always point at the empty. Animate the empty's position throughout the shot to point the camera. You may also need to modify your camera path curve. Towards the end of the shot, animate the influence to decrease to 0 on the Track 2 constraint to return the camera to its original orientation of looking straight at the logo. I also chose to refine the animation further by adjusting the value curve for the follow path offset. I set the first keyframe to have a linear interpolation, so the camera would move at a constant speed at the start. The goal with this camera animation is to create a very smooth motion, keeping the camera pointed at the part of the logo you want the viewer to focus on. Now that I'm happy with my camera animation, there's one more detail to add to the model. Create a new plane object and position and scale it to fit underneath the logo model. In edit mode, add loop cuts along the plane to create separate sections underneath each letter. In the UV editing workspace, go to the top view and unwrap the plane using the project from view method again. Separate the faces in the UV editor and scale them up to use the available space. Create and assign new materials for each section. Now the logo model has a floor, which will also be textured with videos in HitFilm. It's finally time to export this model and bring it into HitFilm. In the description you can find a link to a tutorial on how to install the Blender to HitFilm camera exporter script. Once installed, select the two bar objects and export to a HitFilm composite shot. Make sure Include Selected Objects is checked, as we will be using the position of the bars to animate them later. Next, select all the logo objects, making sure not to select the empty or the curve, and export as an OBJ file. Enable Selection Only to prevent Blender from exporting the other unnecessary objects. Also enable Triangulate Faces in the Geometry menu. HitFilm automatically converts all of the 3D model's faces into triangles upon import, but the n-gons in our model can produce errors in HitFilm. Enabling this option lets Blender triangulate the model instead of HitFilm, preventing these geometry errors from occurring. Back in HitFilm, import the composite shot we exported from Blender. Import the 3D model and enable all of the animation groups. In the Advanced tab, uncheck Auto Normalize for the model's scale. This is necessary to ensure that the model's scale is consistent with the Blender scene and not automatically altered by HitFilm. In the transform properties for the 3D points imported from Blender, remove all of the keyframes. This may take a second, as there is a keyframe on every frame in case the model was animated in Blender. In the 3D logo's models controls, parent the two bar groups to their respective points. Now we can animate the point layers to move inwards towards the beginning of the shot, which will later give the illusion that the bars are drawing in the text. In the Media panel, duplicate the logo model twice and rename them based on the materials we created. On one of the models, change all of the material colors to black except for the glow material. Drag it onto the timeline and disable illumination. Also make sure to parent the bar groups to the points. On the videos model, I chose to set all of the other colors to black as well, although this is unnecessary as all of the other model groups will be scaled to 0 on this layer. On the metal logo layer, scale all of the letter and floor model groups to 0 to hide them. On the video logo layer, scale all of the cube models and the other text object to 0. The reason we are splitting the model up like this is because using multiple video layers as a texture source for a 3D model is very computationally expensive. Having the video letter model on the same layer as all of the other models would make it very hard to work with the comp and make any changes later on when we add the textures. By splitting it into its own layer, we can simply disable visibility for that layer while we work on something else to prevent it from calculating and slowing down our system. We will also be rendering these different layers as separate image sequences for further compositing, so making a change to the metal material won't force you to re-render the videos as well. Now we will set up the materials on the metal model. For the brushed metal material, add in a specular texture in addition to the diffuse texture. Use cooked horns shading and adjust the various material colors. I chose to set the roughness to around 20. Increase the specular reflectivity. The chrome material requires no textures. Use cooked horns again. Set the color to black and increase the specular reflectivity to 100. The dark metal material is the same as the chrome material, except it is less reflective. I also chose to give it a slight amount of refraction. On the video model, change all of the letter and floor colors to be white. We don't want any of these vibrant colors affecting our video content. You can also add some specular reflectivity, but the reflections can sometimes distract from the videos. Also make sure to enable material overrides for all of these materials so we can use a HitFilm layer as the texture source. Next I'll begin to add lighting to the scene. Instead of using HitFilm's actual 3D lights, I ended up doing most of the lighting using an HDRI, or a high dynamic range image. Unlike other 3D software, using an HDRI in HitFilm isn't actually lighting the 3D objects. However, with specular reflectivity turned up on the metal materials, the right HDRI can produce some good looking reflections, resulting in a nice metallic look without using any lights. The links to the images I'm using will be in the video description. I'm using a low-res image, as it'll be blurred anyway. Make the HDRI into a composite shot and use that comp as the environment map on the model. In the project's rendering settings, change the color bit depth to one of the linear options. I go over this in my Thor Hammer VFX tutorial, but the linear color space essentially alters the way HitFilm calculates lighting and color, and can often help with 3D model rendering. Also, the higher bit depth such as 16 or 32 will enable us to use values brighter than pure white in the HDR comp, thus creating a brighter reflection on the model. In the HDR comp, add a 360 blur effect to the image. To control which part of the environment map reflects onto the model, add a 360 video transform effect. Adjusting the rotation values will produce strange results in the viewer, but adding a 360 viewer effect will show what is happening more clearly. Make sure to disable this effect before viewing the result though. I played around with the different values and found some that I liked. This can be quite fiddly, but can also produce excellent results. Add a levels histogram effect to the HDR image and adjust the settings to alter the reflection. I chose to make it darker and to remove all of the saturation from the image. Since the HDRI is in its own comp, you can also transition between multiple images. Repeat the process on the second HDRI. I chose to make the second image very bright in the sky areas, and to fade it in near the end of the shot. I also set the blend mode to add. We now have very interesting reflections on our model. Now it's time to start adding our videos to the 3D logo. Back in Blender, enter edit mode for each letter. Select all the faces, and from the UV menu, select Export UV Layout. This will export an image file showing you where the various faces are located on the square texture. Choose the resolution for your images wisely. If the letter is very close to the camera during the animation, choose a higher resolution. If the letter is always far away from the camera, use a lower resolution to help improve performance in HitFilm. With the UV layouts imported and in their own composite shots, it's time to prepare our videos. I will be using FXhome's Rise of the Dark Side and Assemble short films for the main video content, and will be using still images as placeholders for the rest of the video content. I would suggest making each video into its own comp and slicing out any parts where the video fades to black, or any parts where only text is displayed. Titles and frames with low detail will not look very good when applied to the logo. Plus, with every video in its own comp, you can pre-render the comp to speed up your workflow, or easily swap in a different video. Our logo comp is 20 seconds long, but the video content only needs to last 17 seconds at the most, as it will fade to a solid color towards the end. Drag all of the UV layout comps into the main scene comp and hide them. On the videos model, choose the corresponding UV map as the diffuse texture source in the override material settings. Back in the texture comp, I chose to add an invert effect to the UV layout image to make it easier to see. Drag in your footage and check back in the 3D scene to see which faces of the logo it is appearing on. Translate and scale the video into place over one of the rectangle sections, ensuring that it covers the entire area. Use a mask to make sure the video only appears on that section and doesn't overlap onto the others. Back in the 3D scene, you will now see your video rendering on the faces of the logo model. Continue the process of bringing in new video footage and aligning it and masking it on the UV map. Since the Assemble short film was much longer than 20 seconds, I was able to create multiple comps showcasing different sections. Within your video comps, you are not limited to simply cutting out sections of the footage. You can also reposition the footage to make sure certain content is displayed on the logo. The floor section of the model has faces which are oriented more vertically, so I cut the video in various places and moved it so Ollie was centered at all times. You can even animate the position to follow your actor. In the UV layout comp, I'll add a new grade layer with the hue colorize effect. Choose a color and animate the strength to fade in towards the middle of the shot. Create a new plane and add a dark red fill color effect. This will fade in towards the end of the shot, hiding the videos and giving the logo a solid interior. Copy and paste these layers into the other UV comps, giving each letter a unique color. In the floor plane comp, I had to use multiple grade layers with masks, as floors of all the letters were represented in the same comp. I also used a brighter red for the floor to match the bright red background we'll be adding later. Back in the 3D scene comp, duplicate the metal logo layer. We will be rendering out a separate pass for the main logo and the studio's text, so we can control how the studio's text wipes into view. On each layer, scale the opposite model groups to 0, so you have one layer with just the logo and bars, and one layer with just the text. Before exporting, I would recommend enabling motion blur on all of the model layers for a more realistic result, although this will increase render times. If you use motion blur, make sure to enable it for all of the other model layers, even the mattes we will be rendering out later on. View each layer individually and add them to the export queue. I'll be using the OpenEXR image sequence preset. However, since this version of the project is only using the 16-bit color bit depth, I'll duplicate the preset and change it to render 16-bit instead of 32. Create new folders for each image sequence and start exporting. Create a new comp for the logo layers and drag them onto the timeline. These render passes are 2D layers, so they no longer sit together in 3D space like our 3D unrolled model layers. To make them appear in the right places, we will have to render some mattes. Duplicate the glow model in the media panel, and change all the colors to white except for where the video content appears. Make sure to parent the bar models to the points so they animate correctly. Duplicate the model again, this time in the layer stack. To prevent the studio's text from appearing outside the bars, I exported the default cube model out of Blender and changed the color to black. This model was then dragged into the studio's matte model layer and parented to one of the bar points. I then positioned and scaled the cube to align and cover the white bar, while also being much taller so it would fully hide the studio's text above the bar when in the closed position. I then duplicated this box model, parented it to the other point, and repositioned it. We now have a black and white matte representing where the studio's text should appear. Render this out as an image sequence in addition to the other matte layer and the glow layer. With these matte image sequences brought onto the timeline, apply a set matte effect to the videos model layer, sourcing the logo matte layer. Set the matte source to luminance and the blend to subtract. Copy the set matte effect onto the main model layer and invert it. Paste it onto the Studios model layer as well, invert it, and change the source to the Studios matte. Make sure that the Studios layer is above the main logo layer. Now all three logo layers are appearing as they were in the 3D scene, with the Studios layer being drawn in by the bars. Move the glow layer to the top of the stack and change the blend mode to add. To add the red background, copy and paste the fill color effect from the Floor UV comp onto a plane in the logo comp. Also add a grade layer on top of everything with a vignette effect to darken the corners. On the glow layer, add multiple glow effects with a different radius each time, and with the per channel intensity controls adjusted to give the desired glow color. This glow effect will change throughout the shot based on how much of the glow layer is showing through behind the studio's text. To add a more consistent glow, try duplicating the glow model in the media panel and setting the opacity of the other materials to 0. This will make the glowing bars visible without being occluded by the studio's text. Render this out as another image sequence. Back in the logo comp, change the blend mode to add and add a demold effect to remove the black. Add a fill color effect to change the color, and then a neon glow. Enable clamp to edge on the glow, and also add a blur effect. Without the demold, the neon glow would also add a glow to the black areas of the render, because the alpha is still white there. You can now animate the opacity of the glow layers to fade out once the text is fully revealed. Now to add some finishing touches. On the grade layer, I chose to add a chromatic aberration effect, some glows, a slight radial blur effect, a slight blur effect, and some film grain. Finally, back in the title sequence edit comp, add in the logo comp so its layer overlaps with the transition layer. A simple fade is all that is required to transition between the two clips. And that's how you can create a Marvel-style intro sequence using HitFilm and Blender. Feel free to explore the project file provided in the video description, and to leave a comment if you have any questions. Also included in the description are links to tons of resources related to this project, whether it be more in-depth tutorials on the topics I covered, or website links to get the image textures I used. Be sure to check those out and share your results if you follow along.
Before we end this video, I just wanted to show you some really cool BTS that we took last week on a film shoot. It was a really great location, and we look forward to seeing what you guys think when the video comes out. Keep your eyes open, and we'll see you all in the next video.